welcome to another fantastic interview here on Launch Angle. I'm your host today, half man, half podcast machine, Jake the Snake Robinson, coming out of Pawleys Island, South Carolina. And I am joined, as usual, with my trusted producer, my Swiss Army knife, my Jeff Reveille on the bench, Mr. Brian Belsito. Brian, how are you today out there in dewy Arizona?
I am doing great, Jake. It is a little overcast in Arizona. I am stoked to have Mr. Kendrick here with us, so let's get this show on the road, brother.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, and we do have a fantastic interview lined up for you today. I am so happy to finally chase this guy down. I've been chasing him down for a couple of weeks. To be honest with you, this guy does press all day, every day. I don't know how he does it. In fact, next to Kamala Harris, there's probably no black person on the planet that does more press than this man right now. Would you agree with that? This is Mr. Kendrick. How are you today?
Jake, man, I am great. Thanks so much for having me on the show, and thanks for hanging in there with me.
No problem. I am so glad that you finally took some time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. There's so much in this thing I want to cover with you. And before we get to your awesome museum, I want to talk to you. I want to kind of have a little frank conversation with you, if I can, about the landscape of Major League Baseball today. And I see all kinds of – I got a problem with a lot of things that I see today. I see a lot of cosmetic surgeries on the game. I see guys being put out on second base in an extra inning game, 7-inning games, universal DH. All these things to me are just, cosmetic Band-Aids on a real problem. When I was a kid growing up in the 70s, baseball was loaded with black, I'm going to say African-American players, even though I don't really like that term. As an interracial kid, I consider myself black. But for the argument here, when I was a kid, you had Eddie Murray, Jim Rice, Ken Singleton, Willie Randolph, Willie Wilson, Dave Henderson, Ricky Henderson. You had an explosion of these American blacks, and you just don't see that in the game today. You see guys like Adam Jones running off to Japan to play ball because he can't get a suitable contract. When I look at the problems in baseball, and you might agree with me, you might disagree with me, but I think there is a real problem with the lack of black Americans playing in Major League Baseball today. What is your opinion on that?
Well, obviously, I'm inclined to agree, particularly as a person who runs a museum where there is such a rich legacy of black folks playing this game. And so we know the numbers. The numbers have been widely reported on in terms of the lack of African-American participation in our sport. And so, yeah, we have a vested interest in wanting to make sure that there is a future generation of African-American kids who are going to be introduced to our game, who will be nurtured in our game, and hopefully grow in our game, and maybe one day become professional ball players if that is their desire. But I think it starts with making sure that they are exposed to the game early so that they can absolutely grow in this game. And so as a museum that's dedicated to this history of black people playing this game, we absolutely have a vested interest in wanting to see that. And we think we play a role, Jake, because for me, baseball is even more aspirational than the NBA and NFL. Because you can see the NBA is predominantly black. The NFL is predominantly black. And so as a black kid, when you see Major League Baseball today, you don't see a lot of people who look like you. And so the museum kind of fills that void. When our kids come into the museum, they see people who look just like them, who played this game, man, as well as anybody ever played this game. And so that is important as we create what we hope will be this kind of spark that gets them interested in our sport.
I agree. And I think that your building in particular has a residual role in that. And that's why I wanted to get you here so that, I know in the COVID times, look, I live in Baltimore. We have the Babe Ruth Museum there. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's the same kind of deal. It's a grassroots kind of museum. And, it takes, participation to make these things grow and survive. And we certainly hope that we can do that. Now, let's go to the museum, in fact. And I noticed one thing in my research that the museum sits on the corner of 8th and Vine. And one thing that I've noticed about this museum is that everything is meticulous. Everything is done for a reason. So I got to think in the back of my head that there's a reason that that building is on the corner of 8th and Vine. And what would that be? Why would that be that location?
Yeah, well, the Negro League Baseball Museum operates literally a block and a half away from where the Negro Leagues were formed 100 years ago this year. The Paseo YMCA, literally right around the corner from where we are right now. And that's the building that the meeting led by Andrew Root Foster, who led a contingent of 8 independent Black baseball team owners into Kansas City. They met at the YMCA, and out of that meeting came the birth of the Negro National League. And so the museum established here 30 years ago as a grassroots organization. And we're very proud of the fact that today we're recognized as America's National Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But for those who sometimes wonder why a Negro Leagues Museum is here at historic 18th and Vine in Kansas City, it's because the Negro Leagues were formed here. And so, you know, everybody believes that museums should be in New York or Washington, D.C. No, this museum is exactly where it's supposed to be, here at historic 18th and Vine in Kansas City.
There is no question that Kansas City played a vital role in the Negro Leagues, in both conceptions of the Negro Leagues. Now, another thing that I did notice before we go even further, and you touched on where this should be, there's no question it should be in Kansas City. But what I want to know is, I noticed that Pennsylvania particularly would have 3-4 teams sometimes. Was this because of the Quaker population there, that they were abolitionist friendly people during the Civil War? Would that be like one of the main reasons why you would have so many teams there?
That had something to do with it, but the fact that you had those steel mills, those factory jobs, and so when we look at the migration that occurred after the Civil War, Black folks left the South and migrated to the Midwest and that northern seaboard because they were looking for what I call industrialized opportunities, factory jobs. And so that is where you had a fairly significant concentration. So you start looking at Pennsylvania, Ohio in particular, they had a number of Negro League baseball teams, you know, over that period of 40 years in which these leagues operated. And I think that was part of the reason is that migration of Black folks to that part of the country after the Civil War.
And from what I'm thinking, from what I'm hearing from you, that migration was largely because of, you know, Blacks were trying to get away from the agricultural lifestyle that they had grown up in, and were now trying to go into a more, you know, industry, mechanical kind of deal. Yeah. I totally understand that. Let's start with one of the main fallacies that a lot of young guys don't know about. Even some guys my age might not realize this. Jackie Robinson is not the first Black player to play baseball. He was the first player to break the color line, yes. But there were brothers actually who were actually the first. And I want you to speak on them a little bit. Tell us about Moses Fleet Walker and what happened between him and Cap Anson.
Yeah, you know, Moses Fleetwood Walker, and we always preface it by saying was the first known Black to play on what would be classified as a major league team. And this goes back to about 1883. But Jake, there were other guys like Bud Fowler and Edward White. And Edward White was not known to be Black, but he was Black, that had played on teams even prior to that. And so you're right, there had been a number of Black players who had been involved in white baseball prior to Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier. You know, for us, the distinction is the fact that Jackie broke the color barrier in what we deem to be the modern era of Major League Baseball. But Moses Fleetwood Walker was a barehanded catcher. Ouch. Yeah, he was a barehanded catcher who had joined the team, and guys like Adrian Cap Anson and others formed, quote unquote, a gentleman's agreement that ultimately banned Blacks from playing on what was white professional teams. And the sentiment was basically well, if you allow one to play with you, you can't play with us. Well, Cap Anson was so good. Cap Anson is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So it was
Mhm.
easy for him to build a coalition of followers who shared that same sentiment. And then that would ultimately ban blacks from playing on those white professional teams for the next 6 decades until Jackie Robinson
Mhm.
breaks baseball's color barrier. But the thing that is so amazing to
Unbelievable.
me is there was no written doctrine. It was just a
That's right.
verbalized agreement amongst players, managers, and owners that stopped these black players from playing.
Wow. And this opened the door for Rube Foster, who you talked about before. And I want you to tell the audience, you know, when I think of Rube Foster in today's terms, I think of like a Vince McMahon, you know, a Don King, you know, a promoter with
Yeah,
money, deep
yeah,
pocket, and knew what he
yeah,
was doing. Why don't you
yeah.
tell the audience about
And,
Mr. Foster?
that's the first time I've heard that description, but it's very apt. And I think if
Mhm.
you took the best of Don King and the best of Vince McMahon, you got Rube Foster because he was a master organizer. He was a great
Mhm.
promoter. And Rube Foster, I think you can make the legitimate argument, is one of, if not the most influential person in baseball history. Because, Jake, what people sometimes forget is that Rube Foster wasn't a good player. He had been a great player in the early era of black baseball. So Rube Foster
Right.
was a great pitcher, earned his nickname Rube when he beat the great major leaguer Rube Waddell in a head-to-head matchup. And of course, Rube is credited with having invented, guys, what we now know to be the screwball. Back then, it was called a fadeaway. And Rube perfected
Right.
his pitch, man, so much so that the great major league manager, John McGraw, would sneak Rube Foster into his camp so that Rube Foster could teach Christy Matheson how to throw the screwball. Christy Matheson
That's
threw the
amazing.
pitch all the way into the National Baseball Hall of Fame that he learned from
Right.
Rube Foster. Yeah, but then Foster was best known as this visionary, this tremendous leader. He would organize the Negro Leagues here in Kansas City. He would become president of the Negro Leagues. He owned the Chicago American Giants, and he managed the Chicago American Giants. And he did them all with excellence. He was great at every facet of this game: player, manager, executive. I don't know anybody else who checks off all those boxes. Now, Branch Rickey was great,
Right.
but Branch Rickey was a good ball player. Yeah, you know, and so
Right.
Rube checks every single box. And what he did in creating the Negro Leagues literally changed the game of baseball. It changed it. It
Yeah.
really did. And Jake, he
He
thought
did.
that he would create a league that was so dynamic that he would force Major League Baseball's hand to expand. So think AFL, NFL, or ABA,
Right.
NBA. Now, this is
NBA.
Rube in
Gotcha.
1920. This is 1920 now,
Sure.
and he already
Mhm.
had that vision, and he was almost right. Instead, Major League Baseball focused on that talent on the field.
Yeah. Well, sadly and ironically, as brilliant as his mind was, his death was very, very tragic. And people surely do not know this story. Why don't you tell everybody what happened to Rube Foster in the end?
Rube Foster dies in an insane asylum. One of the most brilliant minds in baseball history dies in an insane asylum. I tell people all the time, you can't make this stuff up. It is too good.
Right.
And Rube was
Right.
on league business in 1925 in Indianapolis when he's exposed to a gas leak in his hotel. A passerby smells the gas, kicks in, brings him out. When he comes out, he's likely unconscious and likely suffered from brain damage as a result, which caused him to have these fits of violent outrage, which forced his family to ultimately have to institutionalize him. 3 years later, he dies of a heart attack. And when Rube Foster died, the fans of Chicago, Jake, lined the streets for 3 days to pay their respect to their beloved Rube Foster. But I can tell you this, there's great belief that that gas leak wasn't accidental, that somebody was trying to take old Rube out.
That's unbelievable. That is so ironic, you know, that a guy who, and
So
by the way,
brilliant.
how did Rube make his money? How did he make his money in the first place?
You know, he had been involved. He had been a successful promoter in this game. See, when Rube formed the Negro Leagues, he had either booking rights or ownership of 4 of the original 8 teams. So Rube had already been a successful baseball promoter. And so he was making money off of this. And so essentially he divested ownership of 3 of the teams and kept the Chicago American Giants. In a deal with the Negro Leagues, he was paid 5% of the annual gate. Well, in 1920 alone, over 400,000 people attended Negro League games. Now, I ain't that great at math, but if I'm getting 5% of 400,000, I'm doing pretty good.
That's right. And even better than the aspect, I have a question that I've always wanted to ask you. Were there ever any white players in the Negro Leagues?
There were. And only a handful, because truth of the matter is, if you were white and you were good enough to play in the Major League. But, you know, Eddie Klepp was the first white guy to play in the Negro Leagues. And then after Jackie breaks the color barrier, Double Duty Radcliffe recruited several other white players because he was hoping that white fans would come see them with the novelty of white players playing in the Negro League. Well, it didn't work out that way.
Right.
But Duty tried. Duty being the great promoter that he was too, he tried, but it didn't work.
So when Rube Foster dies, that's kind of the death of the first inception of the Negro Leagues, correct?
Yes.
And now what happens after the death of him that makes
the timing
go on?
The timing was right around the Great Depression. So Negro League baseball struggled just as many industries in this country struggled during that era. Well, by 1933, Gus Greenlee comes along. Gus Greenlee owned the Pittsburgh Crawfords, and Gus Greenlee revitalizes the Negro Leagues, and he creates the vaunted East-West All-Star Classic. Man, one of the greatest sporting events in American sports history that nobody knows anything about. They would put over 50,000 fans in Chicago's Comiskey Park for the Negro Leagues version of the All-Star game. Yeah, Buck O'Neil would say that black folks, Jake, would come from as far west as Los Angeles by train, as far south as New Orleans, as far east as New York, converging on Chicago for that showcase event. And again, it's almost like it didn't happen. Nobody knew anything about it. But Gus Greenlee then revitalizes it. The Negro Leagues are flourishing up until the time that Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier.
Right. And the thing that I really love about your museum, well, first of all, let me say this to you. I interviewed you back in, I believe in 97, 98, maybe 99. I was on Baltimore radio, sports radio then, and you were just a curator at that time. Could you ever in your wildest dreams have imagined when back then when you were just a curator, a director of marketing, I believe.
Absolutely, yeah.
Could you ever believe that now you would have this incredible possession in your hands and this ultimate responsibility that it carries with it?
No, you don't see that coming. And for me, Jake, I started as a volunteer. in 1993. Who knew? No, there's no way to see that coming.
That's
awesome. I just wanted to be a part of the organization, man. And, as fate would have it, I have been afforded a tremendous opportunity. You carry the weight of a piece of history, though, in your hand, a piece of history that is so fragile. Because it's fragile because the people who made the history are dying. And so it magnifies the importance of this museum. I take that responsibility very seriously, but I also enjoy the work that we do. It is a labor of love.
And I think that's why you're so.
Yeah, no, it is.
And I think that's why you're so successful at it.
Yeah, we enjoy it. And I got to meet so many of the players, and of course my friend Buck O'Neil. And so I'm motivated. I'm self-motivated anyway. But for me, everything that I do is to make sure that the work that Buck O'Neil dedicated himself to for the last 16 years of his life don't fall by the wayside. And that gives is extra pressure, but it's also extra motivation to carry on in his enormous footsteps.
Now, one of your exhibits that I want to speak about is the Field of Legends. And you were just now talking about East versus West, the All-Star game that nobody knows about, but everybody knew about it back then. This exhibit is unique in that the people are separated from the field, and the exhibit is the field. You're separated by chicken wire and glass, and there was a reason for that. Why don't you explain that to us?
Well, chicken wire was a separating mechanism. During that era of segregation, if Black fans were allowed in to watch a major league game, that's how we were separated. So Black fans would sit typically down the left or right field lines, and we would be separated from white fans who sat in the rest of the ballpark by a chicken wire barrier. So we use that same chicken wire to separate all of our visitors from the centerpiece of our exhibition, which is the Field of Legends at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum that features 10 incredible life-size statues of Negro League greats who are anchored in position or cast in position as if they were playing a game.
Oh,
and they
amazing.
represent 10 of the first group of Negro Leaguers to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame at Cooperstown. On the outside looking in is old Buck managing that great all-star team.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing.
And if you get a chance to, in the audience, you should Google it. Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, Field of Legends. It's truly amazing what they have done with that. Now, time is ticking off. I know you're a very busy man. I just want to hit you up with a couple players. Maybe you give us a couple stories and some insight on the player. The first person we already talked about was Rube Foster. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Martin Tehiga?
The great Cuban player from Cuba, El Maestro, they nicknamed him. Played all 9 positions, played all 9 of them well. He is the only baseball player in the history of our sport to be enshrined into 5 different countries' baseball halls of fame. He's in Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and in Cooperstown. Tremendous baseball player.
That is amazing. Buck O'Neil, we just lost him not too long ago. I know he probably had a tremendous impact on you.
It's amazing that it's been 14 years since Buck passed away, but it seems like yesterday.
It really is.
Because everywhere I go, somebody got a Buck O'Neil story. And as brilliant as a baseball player as he was, the thing that I remember most about Buck was the human qualities. His incredible ability to love. Buck had been a great first baseman for the Kansas City Monarchs. He would go on to scout in the major leagues for the Cubs, sign Ernie Banks, Lou Brock, Lee Arthur Smith, Joe Carter to their first professional contracts, would become the first African-American coach in Major League Baseball history in 1962 with the Chicago Cubs, became the voice of the Negro Leagues. Perhaps this game's greatest ambassador, but his greatest gift was leaving us the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. But people always ask me what I remember most about Buck, and Jake, is very simple. You always felt better leaving Buck than you did when you came.
That's awesome.
Yeah, always.
That's a very high compliment that you give somebody.
Absolutely.
The greatest baseball player that ever lived, Josh Gibson. What do you think?
Amazing. The greatest combination of power and average this game has ever seen. Because lost in the tremendous power, and it's almost mythical like power. But as I tell my young major league athletes, the power was very real. Was that Gibson was a great hitter, not a good hitter, a great hitter. Lifetime batting average of 354. And in head-to-head competition against major leaguers in countless exhibition games, hit over 420. What makes it even more remarkable, he was doing this as a catcher. Man, catchers don't do that. No, you get one or the other, power or average, but rarely do you get the combination of the two. And Josh wasn't a good catcher. He was a great catcher. Rifle arm. He's throwing guys out from the crouch back in that era, had complete control of his pitching staff, called a great game. Good running catcher. Gonna steal you 20, 25 bases or more to go with that big bat of his. And as I tell everybody, when I say big bat, man, I mean big bat. 40 ounce, 41 inches. And when you look at the photo, he ain't choking up on it, man. He got it gripped down below the knob. As we say from Georgia.
It's like swinging a redwood.
Yeah, no, as we say from Georgia, the man was just country strong.
That's crazy. All right, let's talk about the face of Negro Leagues baseball, Satchel Paige.
Yeah, well, you know, the greatest pitcher this game has ever seen. You know, I think in my mind. I mean, I don't. There may be those who are as good as Satchel, but I can tell you now, no one was better than Leroy Satchel Paige. And then you throw in the fact that we don't know how old he was. We believe that he was 42, when he got his opportunity to pitch in the major leagues with the Cleveland Indians in 1948. He goes 6-1 with a 2.4 ERA his rookie season at age 42, which means he could have been 52 years old at the time. And Satchel Jake had everything. He had, I guess in Hollywood, we call it the it factor. Yeah, and you don't always know what it is, but you know it when you see it, and Satchel had it. You know, so he had the longevity. He had the great stuff. Recorded some 55 no-hitters and only God knows how many strikeouts. And he had the charisma. He could sell it. But not only could he sell it, he could back it up. And so you hear the stories of him calling in the outfield and sitting down the infield. And so, but, you know, his fastball clocked at 105 miles per hour. Yeah. And so he had everything that you needed to be a star. If he was pitching today in this era of social media, he'd still be the biggest star on the face of the planet, just as he was back then.
Yeah, and he was the gate. I mean, he might pitch three different cities in one day.
Everybody wanted to see that. Right. Yeah, no. He go into small towns, and towns would shut down.
Unbelievable. Well, now let me ask you this. There have been a lot of movies about Negro Leagues baseball. Do movie companies contact you often to get your insight into how these pull these movies off?
We're getting more and more of those calls. I'm starting to read more and more scripts about films and TV series, and I hope and pray that one day it will happen, man. Because again, you don't even have to fictionalize Negro League. Just tell the real story. Yeah, it's good enough. That's right. In its own right.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I really think there should be a Moses Fleetwood Walker movie, man. I really think that is a movie that should be done about someone that a lot of people don't know. Now, when it comes to black baseball movies, what are some of your favorites, and why is Bingo Long and the Traveling All-Stars the very best ever?
Well, it was really the first cinematic portrayal of Negro Leagues that at least referenced Negro Leagues. It's a fictional film. It was based on a fictional novel by the same title, but it had an all-star black cast. You're talking about James Earl Jones, Billy D. Williams, and the comedic genius Richard Pryor. And so it was really the first cinematic portrayal of the Negro Leagues. And we're still waiting for a real epic Negro Leagues film to be done. But Bingo Long, Motown film, Barry Gordy produced it. And it was right after Lady Sings the Blues. And Billy D. Williams is he's a rising star in the industry. And so it had a great cast. It had some snippets of factuality to it, but it was, again, based off a fictional novel.
When I think about my sports, I think about a lot about like music. If I close my eyes and I think about football, I think about like heavy metal, guitar, aggression. I think about NBA. I think about hip hop, the streets. When I think about baseball, I think about jazz, and I think it goes back to like Negro Leagues baseball. And I actually saw something on YouTube, I believe, earlier. The connection of jazz and Negro Leagues baseball. There was a huge connection there, wasn't there?
Of course. I mean, and here at 18th and Vine, it was a cultural crossroads where jazz and baseball intersected. But they were all fans of one another. Yeah, by day, the jazz stars are watching the Negro League players do their thing. By night, they're going to the nightclub watching those guys do their thing. So, yeah, there was a mutual admiration, or as we say, all the jazz musicians wanted to be baseball players. All the baseball players wanted to be jazz musicians.
That's right. And it's kind of the same way it is today.
It hadn't changed.
Let me ask you this now. The one thing that I do love that you guys pull off there, it's kind of like when I go to the zoo and I see the monkeys, and I love the monkeys. You know what I mean? But I always see the one monkey sitting in the corner that's just not looking happy. And it always kind of affects me to my heart. Now, I would think that there are elements to this museum that would probably make you pretty sad. But whenever I see people inside of that museum, I see a lot of smiling faces. And that's a good thing. It kind of vaults over like that period in time. And how do you think that museum is able to pull that off? Because that's a tricky kind of deal to pull off there.
Because we don't focus on the adversity. We focus on what they did to overcome the adversity.
The accomplishment.
And that's the real story. And Jake, I tell people all the time, that story transcends race. It transcends age. It transcends gender. you know. And so, yeah, the circumstances that caused there to be a need for Negro Leagues, we understand that. But the Negro Leagues themselves, there's nothing sad about that story. That is an amazing story, and it's a story of triumph. And I think that's why people have gravitated. It's very inspirational. It's moving, but it's also very inspiring.
So I have a couple of questions for you. In some of my research, well, one really thing that I found out when I was doing some research was that in the news recently, the Giants, the San Francisco Giants, have hired a female coach.
Mm-hmm.
There were actually some female ball players at one point towards the end of the Negro Leagues, correct? Could you maybe give us a little insight on that?
Yeah, there were three women, three very pioneering women who played in the Negro Leagues: Toni Stone, Connie Morgan, and Mamie Peanut Johnson, who competed with and against the men in the 1950s. There were also female leaders and executives in the Negro Leagues, most notably Effa Manley, who she and her husband Abe Manley owned the Newark Eagles, but it was Mrs. Manley who ran the day-to-day operations of the baseball team. She knew the business of baseball as well as any man. Great talent play for her. Larry Doby, Leon Day, Willie Wells, Monty Irvin, all in the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Awesome.
Effa Manley would become the first woman to be nominated and inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So the Negro Leagues didn't care what color you were, and they didn't care what gender you were. Can you play? Do you have something to offer? And that's the
awesome.
way
The other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and my roots of my family are firmly in Philadelphia. And I saw something the weekend of the celebration last week, a couple weeks ago, that mentioned that the stadium where the Stars play is no longer there, but there's a monument built on the corner where that stadium was. Is that something that, are there other spots around the country where some of our listeners, some of our viewers might be able to visit?
Yeah, matter of fact, we're glad, thrilled really to see that there are several stadiums that are being restored. In Paterson, New Jersey, Hinchcliffe, there's a project now to save Hinchcliffe Stadium. In Cleveland, League Park, where played home to the Cleveland Buckeyes. And so, you know, that makes us feel good. Rickwood Field, which is the oldest active ballpark in the country, was home to the Birmingham Black Barons. And so that, and then in Detroit, Hamtramck Field, where the Detroit Stars called Hamtramck home for years. These places are being preserved, and with that, they're helping keep the legacy of the Negro Leagues alive.
That's amazing.
Well, Mr. Kendrick, I got to tell you, I loved having you here, and I love the fact you're talking about preserving these stadiums. I love that you have preserved this part of Americana history right here. Like I said to you earlier, it's a huge responsibility, and you have stepped up to the plate, the proverbial plate, and you have handled your business. And as a baseball fan, I love you. I respect what you do. And baseball, race, all these things were impacted by the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Jackie Robinson comes over, breaks the color barrier, which is really the first salvo for civil rights in this country. And a lot of this is because of the Negro Leagues Baseball Hall of Fame or Baseball Museum. I want to thank you so much, Mr. Kendrick. I enjoyed this time that you spent with us. I appreciate that you were able to sit down with us. And thank you so much for preserving this side and this part of history in baseball.
Hey man, it's absolutely my pleasure, my honor. Thank you guys for having me, and stay safe. I hope to see you soon.
I can add something to that. I just want to tell you, I feel better after this conversation than I did before we went into it. So you are carrying Buck O'Neill's legacy. Awesome. Thank you so much. An honor to speak with you, sir.
Thank you, Brian, man. I appreciate that. Jake, good to see you.
You too. And I want to thank everyone for coming out and listening to the show. Great interview with Mr. Bob Kendrick, the director of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And, you know, what a fantastic show. Now, in a couple of days, I'm going to have an interview with the author of this book right here. It's called Waxback. I don't know if you read this, Mr. Kendrick, but I highly recommend it. The author goes out and he buys 2 packs of Topps baseball cards. I believe it's 1987. He opens them up and he randomly goes to each person's house and interviews the people that he found in the baseball cards. It's a great interview. It's a great book. So we're going to have that interview next week with the author of that book. I want to thank you all for coming out. Thank you again, Mr. Kendrick. Brian Belsito, outstanding job. Parents, if you see your kid and they're sitting on the couch and they're looking bored, by all means, take them outside, play a game of catch. I want to thank y'all for coming out. God bless, and good night.
Take care, guys.